Saul had stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He was supposed to be their strong, capable giant. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's their man of war who they thought guaranteed them security and would make them proud. What you're seeing here is that the king that Israel has chosen to replace God has utterly failed it.
Welcome back to Summit Life. I'm JD Greer, and I am so glad that you are with us again today. Let me ask you this. When I say David, King David, what pops into your head? Sure, David's life has many notable chapters, but today we're going to dive into probably the most well-known one, probably the one that popped in your head, David and Goliath. Everybody knows this story, it seems, but very few truly understand what it's actually about. All kinds of people use it for leadership lessons and bravery lessons, but Goliath's downfall is not meant just to be an encouragement to underdogs or a guarantee that you're going to overcome every giant in your life. How many of you have heard that kind of sermon with David? I'm sure you probably have. The story actually shows us what true courage looks like, where true courage comes from, and what God might be up to when fear creeps into our lives. This is going to apply to you regardless of whatever giant you're facing. Now, remember, if you want to learn more about supporting this ministry and receiving our exclusive resources, then you can do one of two things. Just go to jdgreer.com, or you can give us a call at 866-335-5220. For today, let me ask, you in need of some courage? Does it feel like there's a giant blocking your way? Let's open God's word and see what he has to say to us.
1 Samuel 17. The other day, I saw an updated list of the most common phobias in our culture. The APA defines a phobia as something that causes you such stress that you are no longer able to function in a normal way when that thing is present. There are on that list all the usuals you would expect: arachnophobia, the fear of spiders; ophidiophobia, the fear of snakes. Of course, there's necrophobia, which is the fear of death, and glossophobia, which is the fear of public speaking. Interestingly, and you've probably heard this before, people rank the fear of public speaking higher than they do the fear of death. And so it's like Jerry Seinfeld says, that means for most people, if they have to go to a funeral, they'd rather be the guy in the casket than the one giving the eulogy. In fact, this week I ran across something I'd clipped out of an article years ago about how to overcome the fear of public speaking. Listen, and I quote, "Before you go on stage," if you have to public speak, just remember this. "Before you go on stage, stand still and feel the ground beneath your feet. Close your eyes and imagine yourself suspended from the ceiling by a thin thread. Then imagine you're made of rubber. Look into the mirror and make a horse's laugh with your lips. Why not lie on the ground and pretend you're floating, or just collapse on the ground like a limp doll?" So if you guys ever wonder what I'm doing backstage before I walk out here, now you know. On this list of phobias, there were more bizarre ones like octophobia. Octophobia, which is the fear of the number 8, believe it or not. Olfactophobia, that's the fear of foul smells. Some of you definitely have that. Coulrophobia, which is the fear of clowns. I feel like that's reasonable. Tocophobia, which is the fear of being around pregnant women. Omphalophobia, which is the fear of belly buttons. I'm not making these up. That's a legit thing. I did not specify whether those are innies or outies. I guess that's up to you. But then there's arachibutyrophobia, which is, of course, the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth. And then there is windbagophobia, which is the fear of long sermons. Just kidding, I made that last one up. It's totally made up. Fear of all kinds is a part of life. And your success in life, in large part, is determined by how well you learn to overcome those fears. Something about me that you might find surprising, and that is, throughout my life, I have struggled to find courage in certain things. I say, maybe you find that surprising, maybe you don't. But maybe you find that surprising because sometimes I tend to present rather confidently. And it's like my wife says, often wrong, never in doubt. That's her description of me. But that doesn't mean that there's not fear at work behind the facade sometimes. In high school, I sometimes struggled to find the courage to stand up to my friends and do the right thing. I was afraid of the awkwardness and their rejection if I kind of went against the flow. Throughout my life, I've struggled to tell the truth when doing so, when telling the truth could damage me or make somebody unhappy with me. In high school, I struggled with the courage to ask girls that I liked out because I was scared that she would say no and I would be embarrassed. So I do that cowardly sneaky date thing that guys do, especially Christian guys, where you hang around the girl like you're going out with her, but you never have to man up and actually ask her out. You girls know exactly what I'm talking about. We call it a friendationship around here. I was sometimes even timid to call for the ball in a clutch situation in a game because I thought I would just mess the play up. And one of the darkest chapters of my life happened as a failure of courage. It happened when I was living overseas in a predominantly Muslim country. We had arranged for a short-term trip for some American Christians that I knew to distribute some Bibles to the people in our area. A Bible translation in this language for the first time ever in history had just been completed, and we wanted to get that translation out to the people. So we arranged for these guys to come in and do some strategic drops in various places. Well, to make a long story short, they got caught. They were taken into custody by the police in a city about 10 minutes north of where I lived. They'd caused a riot. A mob of nearly 2,500 people were demanding that the police release these guys so that they could kill them. In fact, that mob burned the car that these guys were driving. The U.S. Embassy tried to send in a helicopter to get these guys out, but it couldn't land because the people were shooting at the helicopter. Eventually, they got them out by smuggling them out in the back of a utility truck in the middle of the night. The police didn't have any direct evidence linking those guys with me, but they suspected it. And so I was placed into custody of the vice mayor of the city who happened to live next door to me. I kept having police and investigators come to our house to ask questions. They indicated that some of the mob knew who I was and they talked about coming for me. At one point, I remember calling my supervisor and just saying, "You've got to get me out of here. You've got to get me out of here. They know that we're connected and I think they might come for us." Now, I'll never forget, he said to me, he said, "You cannot run." He said, "Because if you do run, they're gonna know that you're connected and that'll put our whole platform here at risk. You need to stay there and act normal as long as you can." Yo, I was so terrified. I remember walking out on my third-story balcony where I lived and thinking, if I jump off of here and break my leg, they'll have to take me out. I had several copies of the same Bible that these guys were giving out, and I went into the woods behind my house and I hid them in case the police did a search in my house. I'm embarrassed by all of this now, but this was not the way that I had always assumed that I would handle persecution if it came. Because I was always the guy who told people boldly, you gotta be willing to die for Jesus. Listen, it is one thing to say that to your small group. It's another thing when you think somebody's at the door who wants to take you up on that offer. Maybe you relate to that, or maybe you don't. Maybe you're just one of those people who is naturally fearless. But for most of us, courage is a choice that we have to make. C.S. Lewis said one of the greatest struggles of his life, one of the things he was most embarrassed about was his timidity. One of the greatest struggles was developing courage. So today I want us to discuss how those of us who are not naturally fearless, how we do that. Because this is crucially important in the Christian life. Aristotle, who's not a Christian, but Aristotle said that courage is the cardinal virtue. Because without courage, it's impossible to persevere in any of the other virtues. For example, you may desire to have integrity, but telling the truth is hard sometimes, isn't it? And that means without courage, you're gonna end up folding no matter how much you desire to live a life of integrity. You cannot persist in any of the virtues without courage. 1 Samuel 17 is all about courage. In fact, it might be the most famous courage story in the world, the story of David and Goliath. In this story, we're gonna see four kinds of courage. We're gonna see Saul, he has no courage. Then we're gonna see Israel, they have disappointed courage. Then there's Goliath, he has counterfeit courage. And finally, we're gonna see David, who's got real courage. Little warning as we get started here. Everybody thinks they understand this story. If you grew up in church, this is probably one of your first Bible memories. I cannot say the words David and Goliath without thinking in flannel graph images. Anybody else identify with that? A flannel graph, that's how I see David and Goliath. When I meet David in heaven, I'm gonna be like, you don't look like that, but that's how I think of him. Even beyond church, this story has become a cultural metaphor for whenever an underdog team plays a much better team and they win. My wife went to the University of Virginia, and one of the things she hates is how nobody on ESPN, I mean, literally nobody, can talk about UVA basketball in any context without saying, well, you know, UVA is the only #1 seed ever to lose to a number 16 seed in the NCAA tourney in the David versus Goliath upset of the century. I mean, she hates that. You want to get under her skin, just bring that up. So we are familiar with this story about courage. It's just part of the common parlance in our culture now. But I want to suggest to you that there are some deep Bible things at work in this passage that you might not see at first glance, that get to the heart of what it means to actually have courage. Verse 1, right? By the way, let me just say this again. You're gonna get so much more out of this if your Bible is open right in front of you. Verse 1, now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. Y'all, we tend to glamorize and romanticize ancient warfare, but y'all, it was awful. In modern warfare, we kill from a distance. In ancient times, you killed at arm's length. Armies would form these shield walls and they would thrust themselves together, and then everything became a death whirlpool of spears and swords and fire bombs. Unless you were several layers deep in that shield wall, your chances of survival were extremely low. If you survived at the end of the battle, they say you would usually be covered in blood, not quite sure if it were your blood or your enemy's blood, and chances are you were gonna die of an infection. More people in those days died of infection after the battle and from battle wounds than they did in the battle itself. If you were lying wounded on the battlefield, you were terrified about who would get to you first. Because if it was somebody from your side, you might have a chance of making it out. But a lot of times it was somebody from the other army who would come along with a spear, stabbing everybody who looked like they might be alive in the throat. If you did die out there, it was usually days before anybody would come and retrieve your body. So your corpse would lay there in the hot sun, and the birds of the air and the animals of the field would eat your flesh. No funeral, no burial, no family, just corpses everywhere. That's what we're setting up for here. So these people had reason to be terrified. The battle was against the Philistines. The Philistines were the perpetual enemies of Israel, and they were a fearsome enemy. Sometimes in modern lingo, we use the word Philistine to refer to somebody backwoods. You ever heard that? Oh, he's such a Philistine. The irony is that the Philistines were one of the most advanced civilizations of this era. They were the first people to work with bronze and iron. In fact, we refer to this whole epic of world history as the Iron Age. And the Philistines were the leaders in working with iron. Their weapons and their shields, unlike Israel's, their weapons were made of iron. The Philistines controlled the 3 major cities along the most popular trade route in the world. We call it the Via Maris, the way of the sea. And the 3 big cities on the Via Maris were Gezer, Megiddo, and Hazor. Think of those as the New York City, Miami, and RDU of the ancient world. The Philistines controlled all 3 of those. But here's the thing, y'all. God had given Israel the land of Canaan. That was their land. It was theirs for the taking. Israel had just never fully believed the promise that God would give it to them. That's a crucial backdrop to this story. The Philistines are not supposed to be there. God had promised this land to Israel. Verse 3, and the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. I've actually been to this place. It's about a mile wide, this valley. It's a perfect battle location. Verse 4, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. 6 cubits and a span would make him roughly 9'6". Now, there are some scholars who say that this is a scribal error and that it should read 4 cubits and a span, because the difference in the number 4 and the number 6 in Hebrew is actually really minuscule. And sometimes when these texts were copied, somebody would mess it up, or it would, get smudged. And from that point on, the number would get recopied down wrong. There are a few places in the Bible where that happened, and some scholars believe that's what happened here. If so, and he is 4 cubits and a span, that would still make him 6'9", which is still a giant, especially in those days when the average male was about 5 feet. So whether we're talking 9'6" or 6'9", Goliath was the guy that you wanted getting off the bus first at an away high school football game. You tracking? Verse 5. He, Goliath, had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. Coat of mail, of course, doesn't mean he was plastered with a bunch of postcards and stamps. It's referring to one of those iron metal meshing garments. They were really rare and very expensive, but the Philistines had them. Why? Because they worked with iron. Israel didn't have those things. Interestingly, get this, in Hebrew it says literally a coat of scales. And it's the only time in the Old Testament where the word scales is used to describe clothing. Scales. What image do you think the author is trying to conjure up here? A snake, a serpent. Goliath stands there like this gigantic snake as the enemy of God's people. The writer is trying to make you think of Satan. And the weight of the coat, he says, was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. Why does the narrator keep repeating the word bronze? Well, because the Philistines were the only ones who really had bronze. That's what made them such a fearsome enemy. Israel was outclassed.
Why does prayer often feel more like a task to accomplish rather than a conversation we should enjoy? Sometimes it just seems so hard. In his book titled Just Ask, Pastor J.D. Greear speaks into the doubts and frustrations we often feel when it comes to prayer, and he calls us to embrace the simple joy of just talking to God.
Let's be honest, most of us don't have a happy, healthy prayer life. That's not a judgment, It's just my experience as a pastor and, to be honest, personally also. We struggle with prayer, the what, the when, the how, sometimes even the why behind prayer. Theologian D.A. Carson once said that if you really want to embarrass the average Christian, just ask them to tell you the details of their personal prayer life. We're good on our Bible reading, we're good on our scripture memory, but when it comes to our personal prayer life, we struggle. You know, what's ironic is what was fundamental, instinctive for first century believers has become supplemental in the 21st century church. You know, is it any wonder then that we are often strangers to the power that those early Christians enjoyed? We wonder why God doesn't do great things in our day the way that he did great things through them. But see, the truth is we just don't ask him for those great things like they did. Once again, we need to ask Jesus to teach us to pray. You see, the truth is we can enjoy the same power, the same blessing, the same joy that Jesus and the early church experienced when we learn to truly depend on the Father like they did. And that starts with this one simple activity: just ask.
This book gives specific, practical tips for praying in everyday life, leaving you wanting to pray rather than just feeling like you ought to. Are you ready for an overhaul in your prayer life? Then request a copy of Pastor JD's book titled Just Ask when you give to support the ministry of Summit Life. Give us a call at 866-335-5220. That's 866-335-5220. Or go to jdgreer.com and request this resource or any of the others we have available today. Turn your prayer life from a duty to a delight as you learn to just ask.
Verse 7, the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer, his intern, went out before him. Verse 8, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and I kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." This was called representative warfare, where one person fought on behalf of the enemy. Now, don't think you're arm wrestling match. The stakes were really high. If Israel's representative were to lose, thousands of people would die, and their women and their children would be taken captive or raped or killed. Day and night, the story says, Goliath taunted them. Verse 10, "Give me a man. Give me a man that we may fight together." As they were preparing breakfast in the morning, he bellowed out, "Give me a man." At night, as they were roasting s'mores around the campfire, they could hear out in the distance, "Give me a man." was terrifying. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Wait, who was afraid? Saul was afraid? Don't you remember why the people had chosen Saul? Remember Saul had stood head and shoulders above everybody else? In other words, he was supposed to be their strong, capable giant. He's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's their man of war who they thought guaranteed them security and would make them proud. What you're seeing here is that the king that Israel has chosen to replace God has utterly failed them. Verse 17, meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jesse said to David, his son, take for your brothers parched grain and these 10 loaves and these 10 cheeses to your brothers and see if they are well. 10 bread loaves and cheeses is essentially an ancient deconstructed pizza. So David basically gets sent out on a pizza delivery run. Verse 20, and David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper. I need you to notice how the author of 1 Samuel will not let go how faithful a shepherd David is. I mean, before he goes on this trip, he arranges for a sheep sitter. What a conscientious guy. And he took the little pizza kits and the Hot Pockets and he went just as Jesse had commanded him. And David came to the encampment as the army was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Now, y'all, this is a rather pathetic scene, is it not? All the Israelites are going out, not to the battle, just going up to the battle line and doing the war cry. I mean, imagine you're at Cameron Indoor Stadium and the little countdown clock for when the game starts is approaching 0. The music is blaring. The cheerleaders are doing flips. The team's out there in the huddle and they're going, back and forth. Crowd's going wild. Crazy towel guy's doing his thing. The other team and the refs are out there. The anticipation builds. The team in the huddle yells, go Devils! But then they don't take the court. They just go back and sit on the bench and the scorekeeper puts up a couple more minutes on the countdown clock and they go through the whole ordeal again. And they keep repeating this over and over and over, never taking the court. Eventually, that's embarrassing. That's basically what's happening here. Verse 23, as David talks with them, behold the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, this gigantic, scaly, Satan-type figure, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and he spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So David asked around, he's like, well, who's this meathead and why doesn't somebody go and take him out? And everybody's like, well, because he's 9'6" or 6'9", because we don't know in the text. And David says, well, either way, I'll do it. Verse 28, now Eliab, remember Eliab? You remember him? David's older brother, that's right. David's eldest brother, the one that God had passed over for king, even though he looked so good on the outside. He heard when David spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep? I mean, do you hear the disdain? Listen, runt, hackatone. Why don't you focus on that handful of sheep out there in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down just to see the battle. Yo, how stinging must this have been for David? Isn't it true? Isn't it true that often when you're trying to do what's right, the most discouraging opposition comes from the people who ought to be on your side? Goliath is big enough as it is, but then you got a bunch of family and fellow believers telling you that you're arrogant and crazy for doing what you're trying to do. Well, somebody goes and tells Saul. And at first, Saul's excited to hear that a champion is willing to fight until in walks this 15-year-old baby-faced runt kid. He didn't have any battle experience. He didn't have any scars. He didn't have cool tattoos. Just a shepherd's staff and a harp slung over his shoulder. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go out against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. He's been a man of war from his youth. Translation, David, not only is this guy twice your size, he's been fighting longer than you've been alive. He's got socks older than you, David. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. By the way, I love how David has just given himself a permanent promotion. Do you see that? Notice he says, I used to keep sheep, as in this morning. This morning, that was my job. But now, that's totally in the past. Now my business card says, David, giant removal specialist. That's my new identity. David continues, and When there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after that lion or bear and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. I mean, first, caught him by his beard. What did bears look like back then? Bears with beards sounds amazingly cool. Verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. In other words, good luck being dead, David. Verse 38, then Saul clothed David with his armor. But y'all remember, Saul was head and shoulders above the average Israelite, and David is a runt. So this stuff looks like a clown outfit on David. Verse 39, then David sent to Saul, I cannot go wearing these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then David took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. These aren't real weapons. They're shepherd's tools. They're kids' tools. By the way, these 5 stones, let me just say this on record, are not symbolic of anything. I point that out because every once in a while, I will hear some well-meaning Bible teacher say something like, no, these 5 stones represent worship, prayer, Bible reading, tithing, and K-Love music. Those are all great things, y'all. But that is not what these rocks represent. These are just 5 rocks that he picked up, which I will add, taking only 5 stones feels like a heck of a lot of confidence to me. I would have wanted like 30 of those things. His sling was in his hands, and he approached the Philistine. And when the Philistine looked and he saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? In other words, seriously, you guys sent out Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory to fight me? Harry Styles was the best that you could do? Verse 44, the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. Not bad for a novice trash talker, if you ask me.
In his book titled Just Ask, Pastor J.D. Greear speaks into the doubts and frustrations we often feel when it comes to prayer. And he calls us to embrace the simple joy of just talking to God, leaving you wanting to pray rather than just feeling like you ought to. Are you ready for an overhaul in your prayer life? Then request a copy of Pastor JD's book titled Just Ask when you give to support the ministry of Summit Life. Give us a call at 866-335-5220. That's 866-335-5220. Or go to jdgreear.com and request this resource or any of the others we have available today. Thanks for joining us today on Summit Life. As always, you can visit us at jdgreear.com. We'll see you next time for Summit Life with J.D. Greear. Today's program was produced and sponsored by J.D. Greear Ministries.